It was a cold January evening when my husband's voice shattered the silence. "I want a DNA test." My heart stopped. For 17 years, I had hidden the truth that our son wasn't biologically mine. As he stormed out, I was left with only Daniel, my adopted son. He was my entire world, but little did I know, that night would mark the start of something I could never have imagined. Daniel had always been the light of my life. From the moment I held him in my arms as a baby, I knew I would do anything to protect him. It didn't matter that he wasn't my biological child, he was mine in every way that mattered. His laughter filled our home with warmth, and his curious eyes reminded me every day of why I had made the choices I did. But those choices had a cost. My marriage to David was built on a foundation of love, but it also carried the weight of secrets. When we first started trying for a child, I had hoped for a miracle. Instead, I was met with silence, months turning into years of waiting, hoping, and ultimately realizing that it would never happen. I couldn't bring myself to tell David the truth. I was too afraid of losing him, of being left behind. So I did what I thought I had to. I adopted Daniel in secret, weaving a story of pregnancy and birth to keep David from ever questioning it. For years, the lie held firm. We were a family, complete and happy, or so I thought. Then came that fateful day when everything unraveled. David, for reasons I still don't fully understand, demanded a DNA test. His accusations hit me like a tidal wave, and I could see the betrayal in his eyes when the truth came out. He left without another word, leaving Daniel and me in the wreckage of a life I had worked so hard to build. But in the days that followed, something changed. Daniel, who had always been a quiet and thoughtful boy, stepped into a new role. At 17, he wasn't just my son, he was my anchor. He listened when I needed to talk, offered comfort when I felt like falling apart, and stood by me with a strength that left me in awe. It was in those moments that I realized how much Daniel had grown, not just in age but in character. He wasn't a child anymore. He was a young man, and in many ways, he had become my partner in navigating the chaos of our lives. And yet, with every gesture of support, a part of me couldn't help but feel the lines between us beginning to blur. The days after David's departure were filled with an uncomfortable silence. The house, once vibrant with his laughter and energy, now felt like a hollow shell. Daniel did his best to keep things normal, stepping in to help with chores and even cooking dinner on nights when I couldn't bring myself to get out of bed. His presence was a comfort, but there was something else, a shift I couldn't quite put into words. It started with the way he looked at me. Daniel had always been attentive, but now his gaze lingered just a moment too long, his eyes searching mine with an intensity one hadn't noticed before. At first, I brushed it off as concern, the kind of attention anyone might give to someone who had been through a traumatic experience. But as the days turned into weeks, those lingering glances began to feel different. One evening, as I sat at the kitchen table lost in thought, Daniel placed a cup of tea in front of me. "You've been quiet today," he said, his voice soft. "Is there anything you want to talk about?" I shook my head, forcing a smile. "I'm fine, Daniel. Just tired." He pulled out a chair and sat across from me, his posture relaxed but his eyes never leaving mine. "You don't have to keep everything bottled up, Mom. I'm here for you." His words were sincere, but there was an undertone I couldn't ignore, a depth to his voice that felt heavier than the moment called for. I thanked him and changed the subject, but the interaction stayed with me long after he had gone to bed. The tension grew in the little moments. The way he would stand a bit too close when we were washing dishes. The fleeting touches, a hand on my shoulder, a brush of fingers when he handed me something. Each time, my heart would race, and I'd tell myself I was imagining things. But deep down, I knew I wasn't. Then came the night I woke to the sound of a soft knock at my bedroom door. I sat up, startled, and called out, "Who is it?" "It's me," Daniel's voice came through, quiet but steady. "Come in," I said hesitantly. He stepped inside, his tall frame silhouetted by the dim light from the hallway. "I couldn't sleep," he admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. "I just wanted to check on you." I smiled weakly, motioning for him to sit on the edge of the bed. "I'm okay," I said, though my voice betrayed my uncertainty. He sat down, his shoulders slumped, and for the first time in a while, I saw the vulnerability in his eyes. "I don't know what I'd do if I lost you," he said quietly. "You're the only constant in my life." My heart ached at his words. I reached out and placed a hand on his, trying to reassure him. "You're not going to lose me, Daniel. We'll get through this. Together." He looked up at me then, his eyes filled with an emotion I couldn't quite place. "You mean it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Of course," I said, squeezing his hand. The moment stretched on, heavy with unspoken words. I could feel the air between us shift, the boundaries that had always defined our relationship beginning to blur. I pulled my hand away, breaking the spell, and stood up. "You should try to get some rest," I said, my voice firmer than before. He nodded, standing as well. "Good night, Mom," he said softly before leaving the room. As the door clicked shut behind him, I sat back on the edge of the bed, my heart racing. The tension was undeniable now, and I didn't know how to navigate it. I had always been the strong one, the one who held everything together. But now, for the first time, I felt completely unmoored. The tension between Daniel and me grew with each passing day. It was subtle at first, a lingering look, a touch that lasted a moment too long, but it was enough to unsettle me. I told myself it was all in my head, a product of the stress and upheaval we had been through. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the truth. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, the air between us felt heavier than ever. Daniel was sitting closer than usual, his arm brushing against mine. I could feel the warmth of his body, and it was all I could do to focus on the screen. When he reached over to grab the remote, his hand grazed mine, and I froze. He didn't move his hand right away, his fingers lingering for just a moment before he pulled back. "Sorry," he said, his voice low. "It's fine," I replied quickly, avoiding his gaze. But it wasn't fine. My heart was pounding, and I could feel the heat rising to my cheeks. I stood abruptly, muttering something about needing water, and fled to the kitchen. As I leaned against the counter, I tried to steady my breathing. What was happening to me? To us? I heard his footsteps behind me before he spoke. "Are you okay?" I turned to find him standing in the doorway, his expression filled with concern. "I'm fine," I said, forcing a smile. "Just needed a break." He stepped closer, his eyes searching mine. "You've been so distant lately. Did I do something wrong?" "No," I said quickly, shaking my head. "It's not you. It's just everything." He nodded, but his gaze didn't waver. "You don't have to do this alone, Mom. I'm here for you." The sincerity in his voice made my chest ache. I reached out and placed a hand on his arm. "I know, Daniel. And I'm so grateful for you." His hand covered mine, and the gesture felt more intimate than it should have. "You mean everything to me," he said softly. "I don't know what I'd do without you." The way he looked at me then made my breath catch. His eyes were filled with an intensity one couldn't ignore, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. I should have stepped away, should have set boundaries, but instead, I found myself frozen, unable to break the connection between us. The sound of the clock chiming broke the moment, and I pulled my hand away, turning back to the sink. "It's late," I said, my voice unsteady. "You should get some rest." He hesitated before nodding. "Good night, Mom," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. As he left, I leaned against the counter, my hands trembling. The lines between us were blurring, and I didn't know how to stop it. The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions. I tried to put distance between us, but no matter how hard I tried, the tension lingered. Every glance, every touch, every word felt charged, and I couldn't escape the pull between us. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, there was a knock at my door. "Come in," I said hesitantly, already knowing who it was. Daniel stepped inside, his expression hesitant. "I just wanted to say good night," he said, but there was something in his tone that made my heart race. "Good night," I replied, hoping he would leave. But he didn't. Instead, he stepped closer, his eyes searching mine. "Mom," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "I don't know how to say this, but you're the most important person in my life." My heart was pounding as I tried to process his words. "Daniel," I started, but he interrupted me. "Please, Just let me finish, he said, his voice filled with emotion. I know this is complicated, and I know it's wrong, but I can't pretend I don't feel what I feel. Tears welled in my eyes as I shook my head. Daniel, you're my son. This can't happen. I know, he said, his voice breaking. But it doesn't change how I feel. The pain in his eyes was almost too much to bear. I reached out and placed a hand on his cheek, my thumb brushing away a tear. You're so young, I whispered. You have your whole life ahead of you. Don't let this ruin it. He leaned into my touch, his eyes closing for a moment. I just needed you to know, he said softly. I nodded, my own tears falling freely. I know, I said. And I love you, Daniel. But we have to move past this. He pulled me into a hug, his arms wrapping around me tightly. For a moment, I let myself lean into him, allowing the comfort of his embrace to wash over me. But as the seconds stretched on, I knew I had to let go. Good night, I said firmly, stepping back and wiping my tears. Good night, he replied, his voice heavy with unspoken emotions. As he left the room, I sank onto the edge of the bed, my heart aching. I didn't know how we would move forward, but I knew one thing for certain: things would never be the same again. The tension between Daniel and me had reached its breaking point. I tried to create distance, to rebuild the boundaries that had eroded in the wake of everything that had happened. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were on the edge of something that couldn't be undone. It all came to a head one evening when the house was eerily quiet. David had called earlier to say he wouldn't be coming home, and I knew it was only a matter of time before the divorce papers arrived. I was washing dishes when I heard the familiar creak of footsteps behind me. I didn't have to turn around to know it was Daniel. Mom, he said, his voice hesitant but firm. I set the plate down and turned to face him. His expression was serious, his eyes searching mine. What is it, Daniel? I asked, my heart pounding. He stepped closer, his hands fidgeting at his sides. We need to talk. About what? I said, though I already knew the answer. He hesitated, his jaw tightening as he gathered his thoughts. About us. About what's been happening. I felt my stomach drop. Daniel, there's nothing to talk about, I said quickly, hoping to shut the conversation down before it could begin. Yes, there is, he insisted, his voice rising slightly. You can't keep pretending this isn't happening. I can't. Daniel, I began, but he cut me off. I love you, he said, the words hanging in the air between us like a thunderclap. Not just as my mom, but as more than that. The room felt like it was spinning. I gripped the edge of the counter, trying to steady myself. You don't mean that, I whispered, shaking my head. I do, he said, his voice breaking. I've tried to ignore it, to push it away, but I can't. I love you. Tears welled in my eyes as I stared at him, my mind racing. Daniel, this isn't right, I said, my voice trembling. You're my son. We can't do this. I'm not asking for anything, he said quickly, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. I just needed you to know. I couldn't keep it inside anymore. I turned away, wiping at my tears with trembling hands. You're confused, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. You've been through so much, and you're mistaking those feelings for something else. No, I'm not, he said, stepping closer. I know how I feel, and I know it's wrong, but I can't pretend it doesn't exist. The pain in his voice was undeniable, and it broke something inside me. I turned to face him, tears streaming down my face. I love you too, Daniel, I said softly. But not like that. I can't. The anguish in his eyes was almost unbearable. He stepped back, his shoulders slumping as he struggled to compose himself. I'm sorry, he said, his voice cracking. I didn't mean to make things harder for you. I wanted to reach out, to comfort him, but I knew it would only make things worse. It's okay, I said, though my heart was breaking. We'll get through this. We just need time. He nodded, his eyes filled with unshed tears. Good night, Mom, he said quietly before turning and walking away. As the door to his room clicked shut, I collapsed onto the floor, my sobs echoing through the empty house. I had never felt so lost, so conflicted. The bond between us had always been strong, but now it felt like a burden I couldn't carry. The days that followed were filled with an unbearable silence. Daniel and I avoided each other as much as possible, the weight of our unspoken feelings hanging heavily in the air. I threw myself into work, into anything that could distract me from the chaos inside my own mind. But one evening, as I was sitting on the couch with a glass of wine, Daniel appeared in the doorway. His expression was calm, but there was a determination in his eyes that made my heart race. "I've been thinking," he said, stepping into the room. "And I've decided that I need to leave." My breath caught in my throat. "What do you mean?" "I need space," he said, his voice steady. "For both of us. I think it's the only way we can move on." Tears filled my eyes, but I nodded. "I understand," I said, though the thought of him leaving broke my heart. He sat down beside me, his gaze softening. "This isn't goodbye forever," he said gently. "I just need time to figure things out." "I know," I said, reaching out to take his hand. "And I'll be here when you're ready." We sat in silence for a long time, the weight of everything that had happened between us pressing down on us like a physical force. But in that moment, I felt a flicker of hope, a belief that we could find a way through this, even if it meant letting go for now. The next morning, Daniel packed his things and left for a friend's house. The emptiness he left behind was almost unbearable, but I knew it was the right thing. We both needed time and space to heal, to rebuild our lives and our relationship in a way that felt safe and healthy. As I stood in the doorway, watching him drive away, I felt a strange sense of relief. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like we had a chance to move forward. The days after Daniel left were some of the hardest I'd ever faced. The house felt unbearably empty without him. Every corner, every room, every lingering sound reminded me of him, of the moments we had shared, the tension that had built between us, and the heartbreak of his departure. I spent the first few nights barely sleeping, tossing and turning as my mind replayed everything that had happened. David's absence only amplified my loneliness. We hadn't spoken since the day he left, and I knew our marriage was over. The divorce papers arrived a week later, a cold, impersonal envelope that finalized what I had been dreading. I signed them without hesitation, knowing that trying to hold on to the life we had built together would only prolong the inevitable. With David gone and Daniel distancing himself, I was left to confront the emptiness of my life head-on. I threw myself into my work, desperate for distraction. I picked up extra shifts, volunteered for projects I would have normally avoided, and even took up a new hobby, gardening. Anything to fill the void that Daniel's absence had left behind. But no matter how busy I kept myself, the silence of the house was always waiting for me when I got home. Daniel, meanwhile, kept his distance. At first, he sent the occasional text, a polite "how are you?" or "hope you're doing okay." But as the weeks went by, even those became less frequent. I told myself it was for the best, that he needed the space to figure things out, but it didn't make the loneliness any easier to bear. One evening, as I was pruning the rose bushes in the backyard, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Daniel. "Can we meet?" My heart raced as I read the words, a mixture of relief and anxiety flooding through me. I typed back quickly, "Of course." "When?" We agreed to meet at a coffee shop the next day, a neutral place where we could talk without the weight of the house bearing down on us. I spent the night tossing and turning, wondering what he would say, how he would look at me, and whether things between us could ever truly go back to normal. When I arrived at the coffee shop, Daniel was already there, sitting at a corner table with a cup of coffee in front of him. He looked different, older somehow, more serious. But when he saw me, he smiled, and for a moment, I felt like everything might be okay. "Hi, Mom," he said as I sat down across from him. "Hi," I replied, my voice shaky. "You look good." "So do you," he said, his smile softening. For a while, we talked about small things, his classes, my work, the weather. It felt strange, almost surreal, to be sitting there with him, pretending that everything was normal. But as the conversation went on, the tension between us began to ease, and I felt a glimmer of the bond we had once shared. "I've been thinking a lot," Daniel said after a while, his tone turning serious. "About us. About everything." I nodded, my heart pounding. "Me too." He hesitated, his eyes dropping to the table. I want you to know that I'm sorry. For everything. For making things so complicated. You don't have to apologize, I said quickly, reaching across the table to take his hand. I should have handled things better. I should have set clearer boundaries. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine. Maybe, he said softly. But I think we both needed time to figure things out. And I think we're both stronger now because of it. His words brought tears to my eyes, but they also brought a sense of relief. For the first time in weeks, I felt like we were on the same page, like we were finally moving toward healing. We spent the rest of the afternoon talking, reconnecting in a way that felt honest and real. By the time we left the coffee shop, I felt lighter, as if a weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying had been lifted. Daniel didn't come back home after that meeting, but our relationship began to heal. We talked more often, sharing updates about our lives and rebuilding the trust that had been strained. It wasn't easy, and there were still moments of awkwardness, but the bond between us remained strong. As for me, I began to find peace in the quiet. I embraced the solitude of the house, using it as a space to reflect on the choices I had made and the lessons I had learned. I realized that love, in all its forms, is complicated and messy, but it's also resilient. And while the road ahead wasn't always clear, I knew that I was stronger for having faced it. Months passed, and the dust began to settle. Life didn't magically go back to normal, but it did find a rhythm, a quiet, steady hum of existence that felt, for the first time in a long while, manageable. The house, once filled with tension and uncertainty, became a space for reflection and growth. I began to see it not as a place haunted by the past, but as a canvas for a new chapter. Daniel and I had settled into a healthier dynamic. He stayed in touch, checking in regularly and sharing updates about his life. He had enrolled in a program he was passionate about, made new friends, and even started dating someone, a detail he shared with nervous laughter, as if gauging my reaction. I was genuinely happy for him, and hearing the excitement in his voice made my heart swell with pride. He was finding his way, and that was all I had ever wanted for him. As for me, I spent a lot of time reflecting on everything that had happened. I thought about the choices I had made, the boundaries I had allowed to blur, and the lessons those moments had taught me. There were no easy answers, no neat resolutions. But there was clarity, a deeper understanding of myself, my vulnerabilities, and the kind of person I wanted to be moving forward. The biggest realization I came to was about love. Love isn't always simple or pure, it can be messy and complicated, tangled up in emotions we don't always understand. But at its core, love is about care and respect. It's about knowing when to hold on and when to let go. And sometimes, it's about making difficult choices to protect the people we care about even when it hurts. David and I finalized our divorce without fanfare. There were no dramatic confrontations, no drawn-out arguments. Just a quiet understanding that we had both reached the end of the road. I wished him well and truly meant it. Our marriage had been a chapter in my life, and while it hadn't ended the way I'd hoped, it had given me Daniel, a gift I would cherish forever. One evening, as I sat in the backyard watching the sunset, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Daniel. "Hey, Mom. Just wanted to say I love you." I smiled, tears welling in my eyes. I typed back quickly, "I love you too, always." That simple exchange reminded me of how far we had come. The bond between us, though tested, had endured. It wasn't perfect, it would never be perfect, but it was real. And in its imperfections, it was beautiful. I started to find joy in small things again, tending to my garden, baking new recipes, taking long walks in the crisp morning air. I even joined a book club, something I'd always wanted to do but never had the time for. Slowly but surely, I was rebuilding myself, piece by piece. Looking back, I realized that life doesn't always give us neat endings or clear resolutions. Sometimes, we're left with questions, with loose threads and unanswered what ifs. But that's okay. Life isn't about perfection, it's about growth, about learning from our mistakes and finding the strength to move forward. The experiences I had with Daniel, as complicated and painful as they were, taught me that relationships are fragile and require care. They showed me the importance of boundaries and the power of forgiveness, not just for others, but for myself. And most importantly, they reminded me that love, in all its forms, is worth fighting for. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I took a deep breath and felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in months. Life would never be perfect, but it would go on. And in its imperfection, it held the promise of something new, something hopeful. What would you do if the lines between love and boundaries blurred? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective on this journey. Don't forget to like this video if it resonated with you, subscribe to the channel for more compelling stories, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Stay tuned, the next story will challenge everything you thought you knew about relationship.